In today's episode, I'm going to be sanding this guitar body, but before I do, I need to assess. So let me bring you in a little closer and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Hey guys, if you value and appreciate the information that I share here on my Highline Guitars YouTube channel, consider supporting my channel by visiting eguitarplans.com and purchasing a plan for either building a guitar or one of the tools that you can use to build a guitar. And if you would like to help support the channel but want something more tangible, you can purchase a t-shirt from my merch shelf down below. Either way, there's links in the description. All right, so sanding can fix a lot of problems, but it can't fix everything. And if you look closely, there's a number of flaws that need to be addressed. First of all, I have this really nasty knot right here in the lower cutaway. When I carved this body with the CNC machine, I was hoping that that knot was going to end up cut away, but it turns out it's right there on the edge. So I'm going to need to fill that. I also have some gouging here along this glue seam. This body was made from two pieces that were joined together, and one of the edges was pretty well chewed up, and that's obviously visible right here along the center. I've also got a knot here, and I've got a knot right up in this area. This is actually, I think, part of this knot down here. And then in the forearm contour back here, I've got a knot, and I've also got a knot here. So what I'm going to need to do is fill those. Now, since I'm going to be painting this guitar a solid color, I can use a filler that I don't really have to worry about its effect on the wood grain because we're not going to see it. So what I'm going to use to fill these little problem areas is just some two-part epoxy. Now, when you're filling issues like this, there are a number of different products that you can use to fill the wood. I've got Timbermade here, I've got Aquafill here, and this is just some basic plastic wood. All of these work really well. However, it's important to understand that most of these products are water-based. So when you try to fill flaws like this, they're going to shrink as they dry. And that means you have to keep applying coat after coat in order to get those flaws filled. And that can take quite a bit of time. And eventually, in the years to come, they could shrink back further to where you could actually see them telegraphing through the paint. So for this situation, I prefer to use a two-part epoxy because I can just mix it up, slather it on, let it dry, and it's never going to shrink back. To mix up the epoxy, I'm going to use, this is one of those little plastic blow mold packaging. I always save these things because they make great pallets for mixing up epoxy. And so what I'm going to do is I will pour out equal parts of the epoxy into this plastic container, and I will try to mix up enough to fill these flaws all over the surface. And I'm using, this is a 15-minute mid-cure epoxy, and I like to use the 15-minute stuff because it has long enough working time that I can apply it to a number of flaws on the surface, and it won't dry so quickly. I could also use 30-minute, but the problem with the 30-minute is it does take quite a long time for it to dry. So what I'm going to do is squeeze out equal parts into this little plastic packaging. And then I'm just going to use a toothpick to mix the two together. The nice thing about this epoxy is you don't have to be too precise in the amounts that you mix up. I could also use, I have a popsicle stick here that might do a faster job of getting it all mixed together. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slather it on to those flaws in the wood. And that'll fill in pretty quickly. Another little knot here. This knot back here. And now I'm going to put a lot of it, the majority of it, into this knot in the lower cutaway. Since I cut this guitar on my CNC machine, I could easily start sanding the surface of the wood with 220 grit sandpaper. That's how smooth it is. However, I'm going to be using 80 grit sandpaper. And the reason I'm going to use 80 grit is because I want to scuff the surface or abrade it. I want the surface to be more absorbent. Now, the reason for that is because once I have finished sanding, I'm going to apply some Z-Poxy finishing resin. Z-Poxy finishing resin is similar to your other normal off-the-shelf hardware store two-part epoxies. You mix the two parts together, you apply it to the surface, and then it dries like epoxy. The difference is Z-Poxy has a much thinner viscosity, so it's more absorbent. And that's really important when working with a wood like alder. Alder, even though it's considered a hardwood, it's about the same hardness, maybe a little bit harder than pine. As a result, you can scratch and ding it very easily. So applying the Z-Poxy resin, letting it soak into the surface of the wood and harden is going to make the surface a little bit more durable. And that's why I'm going to sand with 80 grit, because the 80 grit will make the wood more absorbent for the Z-Poxy. I love to use my oscillating spindle sander to get the sides of my guitar bodies as smooth as possible. However, a machine like this definitely takes a touch in order to do the work correctly. You have to move the part that you're sanding very smoothly against the sanding drum. Otherwise, you can linger in one spot too long and form a divot. To sand the sides of the guitar, I like to wrap my sandpaper around one of those giant dollar store rubber erasers. And I like to use those because they conform to the contour shape around the perimeter of the guitar body and make it really easy to sand the surface as smooth as possible. Some spots, like where I use the epoxy to fill in flaws on the surface, are kind of difficult to sand down by hand. So I won't hesitate to grab my little 5-inch random orbital sander with some 80 grit sandpaper disc and sand that down as smooth as possible. Now, as I've said in the past, this guitar design was inspired by the Fender Precision Bass design. However, there are some differences in the design. For example, if you look at a Precision Bass guitar's body shape, you'll notice that the edges are rounded over. And I'm not a big fan of such severe roundovers. To me, Fender guitars can start to look like a blow-up toy. So instead of doing such a severe roundover, I want to do just a very slight roundover. And to do that, I'm just simply sanding with 80 grit sandpaper by hand, and I'm gauging my progress by eye. Of course, it helps to have good lighting in order to make sure that the roundover is consistent all the way around the perimeter of the guitar. But this is a fairly simple way to do it, and it doesn't require me to set up tool paths in my cam operations when I cut the body with CNC. That just really wouldn't make much sense, and it's not an efficient way to form these very slight roundovers. It's better just to do them by hand. The initial 80 grit sanding is done. So what I'm going to do now is mix up my Z-Poxy resin. And I'll mix equal parts in just a small plastic cup. And it doesn't take a whole lot. Maybe half of this plastic cup will be enough to do the entire body. Actually, probably even less than that. But I'm going to try to do the whole body at once, top, sides, and back, which will take a little bit of gymnastics to do this. But the Z-Poxy, the nice thing about it is it's fairly forgiving. So you don't have to get an exactly precise measurement of the two components. You just need to be fairly close. And I'll mix this up with a popsicle stick. And you'll notice I'm wearing some blue nitrile gloves. That's because the easiest way to spread this is with your fingers. And I've also got a toothpick handy because, as you remember, when I cut this on the CNC machine, I drilled pilot holes for mounting the pick guard. And this stuff is definitely going to clog those holes. So I'll just use the toothpick to poke it out, get it somewhat cleared up. Okay, so we've got this nice and mixed up. And then what I'll do is just simply pour it onto the surface like so. And a little goes a long way. You'll be surprised at how far this stuff can go. And you've got a long working time. So I can just start to spread it around with my fingers over the entire surface. And it will soak into the wood. And you'll notice that the wood will start to get a little bit darker as you're spreading it around. That means it's soaking into the surface. Now, one thing you'll notice about this product, or one feature of this product, is if you feel it's too thick, you can thin it by pouring some isopropyl alcohol into the mixture. You'll want to use at least a 90% or higher concentration of isopropyl alcohol, but you can mix that in and it will thin the epoxy and make it even easier to spread and easier to soak in as well. I let the Z-Poxy dry for about 60 minutes outside of my shop, and once that time had passed, the surface had tacked up enough to where I could touch it with my fingers. So I brought it inside, and now I'm going to let it cure overnight, probably about a total of 8 hours. At that point, the Z-Poxy should be fully dried and hardened on the surface. Then I can proceed with the next steps. However, I think I'm going to cover those in part 13. So be sure to check that out once I post that up next week. In the meantime, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there's a couple of ways that you can help support my channel financially. And if you'd like to support the channel but don't want to spend any money, that's okay too. But please consider clicking that thumbs up button. And in the meantime, until the next episode, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.